everybody, and welcome back to the Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and we are ready to get geared up again with another mind-blowing, fun, energetic, any adjective you can think of, evening of studying Jewish history. But before I proceed, I just want to invite you all to a very special program we will be doing over the 8 nights of Hanukkah called Fireside Chats. We're going to have some of the best speakers in the Jewish world. It will be available at TorahAnyone.com. And I hope you will join us for all these programs. Yes, there is one that coincides with the Jewish Destiny series, so you'll have to choose one as a live stream and watch the other one recorded later. But it is going to be a week of inspiration during the holiday of Hanukkah, and I hope that you will all join us. And now, let's jump right back into the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. We are picking up today, right where we left off last week, which was in the discussion of Rome having taken over the country of Judah, the country of Israel, in a peaceful state and making it a part of their empire, and what that meant for the Jews. Now, the people in control in Israel are a family of the man by the name of Antipater, who is probably not Jewish, or at least of questionable lineage. He is an Idumean, which means his family was forcibly converted to Judaism, leaving his halachic status as questionable. And they are in control of the country as appointed by Julius Caesar, the emperor in Rome. And the family that has all they have left at this point is the Kohen Gadol, the high priestship. That is what's left of our friends, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. That is all they have. So that's the situation we are finding ourselves in now. Antipater is in control in Israel. His official title, as it's given to us, is he's the procurator of Judah. And we have Julius Caesar, who's on the throne in Rome. And we still have a remnant of the Maccabees, who are at least the high priests in Israel at this time. Okay, let's switch scenes over to Rome for a minute and look at what's going on over there. So Julius Caesar's the emperor. He is beloved by the people in the accounts that were given. The people like him. He does wonderful things for the people. But there's definitely a power struggle between him and the Roman Senate, because he is trying to make them superfluous and make the role of what becomes known as the Caesar, named after him, the main role in the country. And therefore there is much let's say ill will. There is much friction between Julius Caesar and the Senate. Now, ultimately, we'll see how this struggle comes to an end. But one thing that Julius Caesar does vis-a-vis Judah/Israel when he takes over as the Caesar is he had a policy throughout the Roman Empire. One of the ways that he was able to keep control of such a vast empire in antiquity, it wasn't like he could visit every part of the empire on a regular basis, because if he needed to travel there, he had to do it by, horse or boat or elephant, and therefore there were probably parts of his empire he never even saw. So he would put governors or procurators in charge of different parts of the empire, but make sure that no one official got too much land under his control. That way, through dividing areas into as many groups and subgroups as possible, having a tremendous pyramid of leadership, if you will, that would help to prevent against rebellion. Because you would, let's say hypothetically, if one procurator wanted to rebel against Caesar, well, he maybe had 5 governors underneath him, and he would have to get all those 5 governors to fall into line with his rebellion. So therefore, it was one of the systems that Caesar had put in place to try and avoid rebellion. What this meant for Israel was our old friend Antipater was appointed as the procurator of Judah. He was the head of the area. And under him, there were a number of governors. There was one governor by the name of Fitzael, who was actually one of Antipater's sons. And he was the governor of the Jerusalem area. We had another man by the name of Herod, Hortus in Hebrew, who we'll talk more about in depth shortly, who was the governor of the Galilee, or the Galil region. And then we had 2 other regions. We had what is modern day Jordan, which was under Antipater, but was controlled by a Roman governor. And then we had the area of the east coast of Israel, the Mediterranean coast, which was controlled by another Roman governor. So this is how Caesar set up the country to try to avoid rebellion and make sure to divide up the power. And that is a situation we find ourselves in at this time. Okay. Now, as for Julius Caesar, because he had this friction with the Senate, it will ultimately lead to his demise, and there's going to be a rebellion of the Senate against him that will ultimately end in his life being taken via assassination. And there's different accounts as to how many of members of the Roman Senate were involved in the assassination plot. Maybe it was 5, maybe it was 30, maybe it was 60. We don't know for sure. But be it as it may, there was definitely an element of the Roman Senate that had plotted to kill Caesar and successfully carried out their plot one day when Caesar was in the chambers of the Roman Senate. Now, we all know the very famous last words of Caesar at the time that he was killed. The words "et tu, Brute," which for those of you who aren't fluent in Latin means "you too, Brutus," meaning that one of the main co-conspirators of the assassination of Caesar was none other than his very dear friend Brutus. And when Caesar recognized him as one of his assailants, he, in his dying words, said, "Et tu, Brute, you are also part of this, Brutus, you too, Brutus." Now, there's only one problem with this story, and that is it most likely never happened. It is given to us through William Shakespeare's book, Julius Caesar, which is a historical, somewhat fiction that accounts the life of Caesar, and specifically it has the murder of Caesar and has these famous words "et tu, Brute" that were probably never said by Caesar. According to certain accounts, he did not say anything after he was assassinated. According to other accounts, he might have said something to recognize the fact that his friend Brutus was involved, but definitely not the words "et tu, Brute." Those words are written by Shakespeare. Okay, so Caesar is dead, and the people of Rome go into a state of national mourning because they love Caesar. And the miscalculation of the Senate was they thought, okay, we'll knock off Caesar and power will be in our hands. There was only one problem, and that was because Caesar was so popular, there were definitely those who were in Caesar's court and therefore took up the goal of avenging Caesar's blood, at least against the Senate. And once again, Rome is thrown into a bloody civil war. And the two belligerents, the two sides of the civil war were Brute, and Cassius, who represented the Senate, represented or at least the rebels who plotted the assassination of Caesar. And on the other side, we had two men by the name of Mark Antony and Octavius. If you know anything about Roman history, you probably also know those two names. Now, in this war, we see that those who plotted to kill Caesar are not successful. They are overthrown by Mark Antony and by Octavius, and Mark Antony and Octavius become the rulers in Rome. We have what's called the Second Triumvirate, actually, because there's a third man who was an ally of Caesar by the name of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who is, as you probably know if you know anything about Roman history, but is the least significant of the three. We don't know much about him because he comes to a pretty enigmatic ending, as we'll see shortly. And they form the Second Triumvirate. But similar to the first triumvirate, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're going to see that it doesn't last very long because the three government leaders end up, yes, you guessed it, once again in a civil war with each other as to who should be the lone ruler, the lone Caesar of the Roman Empire. But just so we have everything straight, for our purposes, we're going to have Mark Antony, who is going to be in control of the western part of the Roman Empire, stationed once again in Egypt, and Octavius, who will be in charge of the eastern part of the empire, stationed in Rome. Okay, that is our Roman backdrop for the story that we now have in Israel, that we now have in Judah. Again, Israel, Judah, we're using those words interchangeably. During the whole Second Commonwealth, the country is called Judah, but it's what we nowadays call Israel. Parenthetically, when the modern-day state of Israel, the Medinat Yisrael, was founded in 1948, it was not known until the last minute what the country would be called. Would it be called Israel, as was the original name back in the beginning of Bayis Rishon, or the First Temple, or would it be called Judah, which was the name during the Second Temple? Obviously, the decision was made to call it Israel. But that was a debate, and it was not known until the Declaration of Independence was spoken in 1948. Okay, back to Israel/Judah. Now we focus in on our main cast member for tonight's production, Hordes/Herod. So Herod, as we mentioned, was a son of Antipater, the Idumean, forcibly converted to Judaism, leaving their status as a Jew in question, and we'll see that will continue to come into question. And while Antipater is in charge of the country, as the procurator, we have Herod, who is the governor of the Galilee, the Galil, the northern part of the country. Herod was a character that psychologists could absolutely go to town on. We would probably label him as a megalomaniac, a narcissist, a sociopath, any of those terms that define somebody who's always looking for power and won't stop at anything to remain in power and to be in power. That was our friend Herod. Now, along those lines, there were two main things that Herod was known for. On one hand, and they both fall into that, being a megalomaniac. One, he was a tremendous murderer. Anybody who got in his way, or he perceived to get in his way, he knocked off. Number two, he was a tremendous builder. He definitely understood at a certain level his mortal nature and wanted to leave his fingerprint on the world, or at least on the country of Israel, and therefore took on massive building projects, of which we still have many, not in full tact, but at least many that you can visit today in the state of Israel. So we'll focus on both of these things. First of all, let's focus on the fact that he was a murderer. So at this point, again, he's a governor. He's not even the procurator, which was the highest official. He for sure isn't the Caesar. He is in no way above the law. Yet, at this time, anyone whom he perceives to be a political threat, he knocks off. And he ends up killing tens, if not hundreds, of people in the Galilee that he perceives to be his political opponents. And this doesn't go over so well with the Jewish community because, hey, let's face it, in Judaism, murder is illegal, right? Not recommended. One of the three Yaharig Val Yavors, one of the three cardinal sins, and even though his status is questionable, Jew, non-Jew, it is also prohibited by the Torah for a non-Jew to kill. So whether or not he's Jewish or non-Jewish, as a murderer, it's a problem. And the Sanhedrin actually arrests him and brings him to trial in Jerusalem. Now, this is just about the end of the Sanhedrin as we know it. We're going to see it morph within a few classes. By the year 40 of the Common Era, which will be just a few years from tonight, the Sanhedrin will be of much less power than it is, but at this point they're still trying murder trials, and they arrest Herod and put him on trial for the murders that he has perpetrated in the north of Israel. Now, when Herod comes to his murder trial, he comes with all the bravado that you can imagine. He comes with his own armed guard. He is dismissive of the whole process. He walks in with all the ego in the world. And for the most part, that approach works. Most of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin are intimidated by Herod. Again, at this point, we have to remember, the Romans are in charge of the country. Herod is definitely a Roman official. He's very much aligned with the Romans, much more so than with the Jews. It's questionable at this point how much strength or power the Sanhedrin really has. So the rabbis have reason to be nervous, and we see that most of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin are very nervous of the situation. While Herod is clearly guilty, while he's been warned, there's witnesses, they can easily find him guilty of the death penalty under Jewish law, the rabbis get cold feet. And there's only one rabbi on record that we have that stands up to Herod, that wants to take the trial through to the end, that wants to find him guilty of the death penalty, and that is none other than the famous Shammai. So at this point, the leaders of the Sanhedrin are our famous Hillel and Shammai, the great Hillel and the great Shammai. Hillel has the position of being the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and Shammai is the number 2 position, the Av Bezdin. And we see that Shammai is not intimidated by Herod. He wants him to be found guilty. He wants to take the trial through to the end. But many of the rabbis do not agree with him. What ends up happening is this. The trial comes to an end one day. Herod goes to jail, wherever they take the defendants when they're still in the process of trial. Enters our old friend, old man Hyrcanus, who's an old man at this time, right? So remember Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus at this point is pretty much the last of the Hasmoneans, the last of the Maccabees. He still has the position of Kohen Gadol. He has no political power whatsoever. But, in a way to try and ingratiate himself with the powers that be, so to speak, he lets Herod off the hook. He smuggles Herod out of jail. He helps him escape, and Herod escapes to Egypt. Now, as we said last week, Herod, now it's unclear what the timeline is, but Herod, either before or after this point, is actually married into the family of Hyrcanus. He's married to Miriam, who is most likely Hyrcanus' granddaughter. According to some opinions, it might have been his niece, but whatever it is, he's either already married into the family or will be married into the family. But be it as it may, Hyrcanus, who is just as intimidated as everybody else, lets Herod free. Herod is able to escape out of Israel. He's able to hide out in Egypt while they are looking for him, so to speak, in Israel. And you would think, at least for the time being, he is scot-free. He is okay. There's only one problem. As the rabbis mount their international investigation, they try and find Hortus, they try and find Herod, they find out that he is in Egypt, and they appeal to none other than Mark Antony to say that you have Herod, who, yes, is the Roman governor of the Galilee, who is hiding out in Egypt, but he's guilty of murder. Now, that was not only a problem from a Jewish perspective, but it was also a problem from a Roman perspective. I mean, Rome had at least at this point, had a certain amount of law and order as part of their government. And as a governor who is for sure not the Caesar, not the procurator, is further down in the pecking order, he couldn't just murder people willy-nilly. So the rabbis didn't try to pull the Sanhedrin card with Mark Antony. They pulled the Roman card with Mark Antony. They said, we are here to testify that Herod is guilty of many murders within a state, within a region of the Roman Empire, and therefore should be put on trial. And sure enough, Mark Antony puts Herod on trial. Now, at this point, Mark Antony has a very famous wife by the name of none other than Cleopatra. And Cleopatra hated Herod, hated Antipater, hated the whole family. There had been nothing but strife between Cleopatra and the family of Antipater, the family of Herod, and Cleopatra had no time or patience, and therefore her whole approach was throw him to the wolves. She agreed with the rabbis. She wanted the trial to go through to the end, for him to be found guilty of murder, for him to be put to death, and then they'd be done with at least one part of Antipater's family, and be done with Herod. That is what Cleopatra wanted to happen. But her husband, Mark Antony, saw something else over here. He saw a tremendous potential in Herod. And he said, I can use this guy. He's worth more to me alive than he is dead. And therefore, Mark Antony is able to finagle the trial to get Herod to be let off the hook. And not only is he found not guilty, but he turns around and he appoints him as the procurator of Judah. Now, one second, what happened to Antipater's father? Oh, I forgot to mention, at this point, he had been assassinated, right? No more Antipater in the picture. He had already eaten or drank something that didn't agree with him, and he is now out of the picture. So the position of the head of the whole country is now none other than Herod. Now, based on how we've described him so far, you can imagine how Herod deals with this situation. He comes back to the country. He is now appointed procurator. He's one level up. He's gone through the Sanhedrin to a certain extent. He's gone through the Roman courts. You can imagine how by this point he has a certain feeling of invincibility. So you can imagine what happens to any opponent that gets in his way. There's only one problem. And that is, as we mentioned, the Second Triumvirate starts to crumble. Mark Antony and Octavius start to have differences. And we see that they go to war. And we see that in the end of that war, who is the one that is successful? It is not Mark Antony, but it is Octavius, who now changes his name to Augustus, or Augustus Caesar. Now, parenthetically, as we mentioned these names of these Roman Caesars, they might sound a little bit familiar, not just from your world history class in high school, but from the months of the calendar. That is July, Julius, August, Augustus, and yes, there is no coincidence over there. Now, why? Think about the months of the calendar. We have a very interesting situation. So right now we're in the month of November, which is a derivative of the Latin. And what does November mean? Nov, what does the prefix nov mean? November means 9th month. You might say, well, one second, this is the 11th month. Okay, well, what month will start in just a few days, on next Wednesday or whatever it is? It'll be the month of December. What does December mean? Deca, decimal, right? Decade. It means the 10th month. But one second, December is only is the 12th month. So why is it that we call our 11th month the 10th month, the 9th month, and we call our 12th month the 10th month? Very simple. Because when Julius Caesar was the emperor of Rome, he wanted a month named after himself. So what does he call that month? He calls it July. And he doesn't want a short month like February. He wants a nice long month. So he makes it the longest month of the year, right in the dead of the summer. When Augustus becomes Caesar, now Augustus in many ways was a protege of Julius Caesar. He was his adopted son. He was very close with him, and he wanted the same thing that his adopted father had. So therefore, he takes the next month, also the longest month of the year. By the way, the only 2 months next to each other that have 31 days, and that became August, making our calendar a 12-month calendar, and having a month named after Julius and Augustus Caesars. Okay. So Augustus Caesar comes out successful in war. There's no more triumvirate. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, all the opponents, Lepidus, all put to death at this point, and Augustus is the lone ruler of Rome. Now, this time period is known to us as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, because even though it is, yes, by modern standards, still a very tumultuous time, but compared to much of Roman history, it is somewhat peaceful. So, because we're going to see that Augustus Caesar leads Rome for a very long time, and therefore we call it Pax Romana, and the country of Rome is able to flourish to a certain extent. But now Herod has a problem. Because who was his sponsor? Who had he aligned himself with? Mark Antony, who was the loser here, who had lost the war. Now, the way things worked in antiquity is if you sided with an opponent who ended up losing a war, that didn't mean you just, went on your merry way. No, if you were aligned with an opponent, not only was the opponent put to death, but you were put to death too. So by Roman law, essentially, Herod had a death penalty on his head. Finally, right? The Sanhedrin tried to get death penalty on his head. Mark Antony tried to get death penalty on his head. Now, because he aligned himself with Mark Antony, he has a death penalty on his head. But again, Herod, like his father Antipater before him, being a very wily, cunning politician, what's he do? Sure enough, leaves Israel, goes into hiding, and in an amazing odyssey makes his way from Israel to Rome without being discovered, without being caught, however he does it. And not only that, but is able to make his way into the court of Augustus Caesar. He identifies himself as Herod, and he says, I know that I made the wrong choice in the war, that I was aligned with Mark Antony, but Mark Antony's gone. I am completely beholden and obliged to you now, Augustus Caesar, and I am here to serve you and to help you. Augustus, like Mark Antony before him, realizing that Herod is much more valuable to him alive than dead, takes Herod and upgrades him one more step. He is now not the procurator of Judah, but he is the king of Judah. But Augustus makes it clear, you're my king. You're a puppet to Rome. We're going to call you king. You can have all the pomp and circumstances of being king, but you're my king, says Augustus. And they make a ceremony in Rome to formalize this relationship. They sacrifice to the Roman gods, which just imagine the situation for a moment. You have this now non-Jewish king, the first one that we've basically ever had. Maybe Italia was not Jewish, but okay. We have a non-Jewish king appointed over Israel by the Romans, and they solidified the service through a sacrifice to the Greek gods. Just paves the way for wonderful things to come, right? Herod goes back to Israel, takes his place on his newly minted throne, and what do you think he does now to all those who opposed him? Because now there's no triumvirate. Now there's not really a senate in Rome, at least one that functions at any level, and he is called king, which means he has basically the immunity to do whatever he wants, and he sure enough wreaks havoc on all of those whom he perceived slighted him, and anyone who he perceives as a threat to him. And sure enough, he tries to kill all the rabbis of the Sanhedrin who called him to trial. Now, the only one he doesn't go after is actually Shammai. He actually respects Shammai because Shammai stood up to him. But all the other rabbis sentenced to death. All the opponents sentenced to death. And not only that, but don't forget, as we mentioned, he's actually married into the house of the Hasmoneans. His children, through Miriam, are technically descendants of the Hasmoneans. What do you think he does with them? Well, he ends up knocking off old man Hyrcanus. He ends up killing his own two children, because these two children are descendants of the Maccabees, because he perceives them as a threat. And we have a story accounted to us of Miriam, who they had just a love-hate relationship. Herod loved her, she hated him, right? That was their relationship. He was infatuated with her, she couldn't stand him. So Miriam at one point is fed up with this guy, understandably. He killed her children. And she stands up on a tower and she announces, anybody henceforth who claims to be a descendant of the house of the Hasmoneans is nothing more than a slave. Because at that point, she was the last of the Hasmoneans, and she was making the point that even if Herod would claim to be a Hasmonean, or any descendant through Herod, at best would have the status of being a Jewish slave. And she jumps to her death, but it's a failed suicide attempt. Herod has her arrested, she's put on trial, and then she's killed the Roman way. With that being the end of the Hashmonaim, the end of the Hasmoneans. So we mentioned before how the Hashmonaim started off great, and they come to this very enigmatic ending, being wiped out by Herod, who was a Idumean, forcibly converted by one of them. It can't get better than this in the soap operas. The drama can't get better than this. But you now have Herod on the throne of Israel, unchallenged. Any possible perceived threat is gone. And now what does he do? Well, one thing he does throughout his reign is, in his ability and his megalomania, he wants to be remembered, he wants to leave his mark, so he goes on many, many tremendous building projects. And it's crazy to think about that all in all, his reign as the king of Judah probably began around the year 36 before the Common Era, and we're going to see that it lasts for about 37 years. And this is 37 years in antiquity. Yes, in modern times you can throw up a building in 6 months, but in antiquity it was not so easy. Yet we see his fingerprints all over the country today. If you've ever been to Hebron, to the Cave of the Patriarchs, to the Mars HaMachpelah, the building on top of the Cave of the Patriarchs was built by Herod. If you've ever been to a place called Herodium, built by Herod. If you've ever been to Masada, the fortress of Masada, Masada was the summer home of, the summer home or the winter home maybe of Herod. If you've ever been to Caesarea, Caesarea was built by Herod. If you've ever been to the old city of Jerusalem and seen something that we call the Tower of David, had nothing to do with King David, it was built by Herod. Now, the one sign of Herodian construction that makes it obvious is that Herod not only built these tremendous buildings that have stood the test of time, but he also had his signature put on every single stone and every single building that he built. And that is, we'll put a picture here on the screen, that he made this frame inside every single throne, this indenture on the sides, the middle part protruding out on every stone. And therefore, when you're at all these places we named before, Caesarea, Herodium, Mars HaMachpelah, etc., you will see that the stones are Herodian stones. Now, the most famous of his building projects came through like everything else in his life, came through an absolutely crazy story. Because he had put so many rabbis to death, and because he was at such odds with the rabbis, there were some rabbis that were actually put to death, but other rabbis that he just tortured in other ways. One such rabbi was a rabbi by the name of Baba ben Butra. Now, Herod, perceiving that Baba ben Butra had slighted him, had the rabbi's eyes gouged out. Okay? Now, one thing that we have to say about Herod is he is a complicated figure in more ways than one. We see that while he wants to destroy every possible opponent, he also does want to be beloved by the people. He wants to be appreciated. And therefore, we see that he often has, at least at some level, a guilty conscience of what he does to the people, or does to the rabbis. And that was the case, the Talmud tells us, with Baba ben Butra. That after he blinds Baba ben Butra, he feels bad about it. He says, maybe I was wrong. And what he does is he has a meeting with Baba ben Butra, who's now blind, does not identify himself as Herod, disguises his voice, and starts basically speaking slander about himself, hoping that Baba ben Butra will agree, and therefore giving him justification and what he had already done and putting his eyes out. So he started saying, oh, that Herod, he's terrible to the rabbis, he blinded you, he did this, he did that, and Baba ben Butra responds, no, he's really not so bad, he's done great things for the country, he has these great building projects, okay, he didn't treat me so nice, but okay, he's really not that bad. Which makes Herod full of remorse for what he had done to the old rabbi. So he identifies himself, he says, Rabbi, it's really me, it's Herod, I have to apologize, I was wrong, I shouldn't have done what I've done, I shouldn't have done what I've done to all the rabbis. How can I ever repay everything I've done wrong? And Baba ben Butra says, you should refurbish the temple and make it the most grand building in the whole ancient world. So Herod says, done. Okay, not done. It takes a very long time. The project begins somewhere around the year 19 before the Common Era, and it's questionable if it was ever completed. According to some accounts, it's only completed about 5 years before the temple is destroyed, and the year 70 of the Common Era is when the temple will be destroyed. So roughly the year 65 is when it's finished. So it's an 85-year building project, but it seems it's definitely not finished in Herod's lifetime, because Herod's only going to live for about 20 more years. But the building that is built was absolutely magnificent. In many ways, it was probably even greater than the Temple of Solomon. And one of the things that we know that Herod did is the Temple Mount was not even big enough for the great building he wanted to build. So the very first step of his process of refurbishing the temple is that he expands the top of the mountain, the top of Mount Moriah, by building a huge platform about 4 times the size of what it was before. Now, in antiquity, how did you do that? They didn't have steel frames they could put underneath the platform to hold it up. Well, if you've ever been in the Kotel tunnel tours or in any of the excavations of the Old City of Jerusalem, you'll see that all over the place there are arches. And that is how they build this platform. They would build an arch, and they'd build a platform on top of it. And that was how the Temple Mount was expanded by Herod to be about 4 times the size of what it was before that. And in order for this mount, that's now 4 times the size, to be able to be sturdy, you not only make the arches going all around and the platform on top, but you make a retaining wall going around the mountain to hold the mount into place. Now, this is significant for us for many reasons, but not the least of which is today. The main remnant of Herod's temple that we have is none other than the Kosa Hamaravi, the Western Wall. The Western Wall of what? That was not the Western Wall of any building of the temple. It was the Western Wall of this retaining wall that went around the mountain to hold up the platform that Herod's temple was built upon. So it's just interesting to think about that when we go to the Western Wall to pray, yes, it's all we have. It's the remnant. It's holy in its own right, but it's literally the outer fence of what the temple was. That's all we have left. So if we treat it with such deference and revere as we do, imagine what we'll treat the temple like when it's rebuilt. Now, as we know from our discussions, Hanukkah story, whatever it is, the temple service is a daily service, twice a day, every single day. So when Herod came to refurbish the temple, it wasn't like he could just close the temple for business for 60 years or 80 years or however long it was to be able to refurbish it. So what he does is he leaves the temple functioning full speed ahead. He first builds the platform, quadrupling the size of the Temple Mount. Then he builds all of the new buildings on top of the old buildings, and then has the old buildings dismantled from the inside out. So therefore, the temple service never has to cease on a bi-daily basis. And that is how Herod refurbishes the temple. Now, Herod was still a Roman puppet in every way, shape, and form. So therefore, when he completes the temple, he has a golden eagle perched onside the outside of the temple, which was, the eagle was the sign of Rome. And we're going to see that the students of Shammai come and tear it down, and that will not end too well for them. And but be it as it may, it's just an interesting dichotomy that we have, that in many ways the country's going way down. We have the country in control of, at best, a slave, right, but probably a non-Jew, definitely a Roman puppet, definitely someone who didn't practice Judaism. We have the country fully as part of the Roman Empire. We have the rabbis who have very little power. And yet we have the temple that's rebuilt into a magnificent state. It's just one of these interesting dichotomies of history that happens at this time. Now, last 2 things we'll say for tonight. Number 1, as we mentioned before, the leaders of the country, the Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin are Hillel and Shammai, the famous Hillel and the famous Shammai, who we mentioned briefly last week, talk maybe a little bit more about next week. But Hillel and Shammai see the writing on the wall. They know that the country, the Commonwealth, is doomed to be destroyed. It's doomed to come to an end, unless things would turn around rapidly. So they start to put things into place that will be carried on by their descendants to take Judaism, which is a nationality, with Judaism being our national religion, and to make it to be able to function as a state without a homeland. Which you might say, yeah, okay, we've done that for 2,000 years. But we are an anomaly in history. To the best of my knowledge, never before has there been a people who is able to survive not for a generation, not for multiple generations, but for 20 centuries, for 2 millennium, as a people in exile. How have we been able to do it? Yes, in part it was a guarantee from Hashem to Moshe. We would never be destroyed, even in exile. But practically, we see that it was a lot of the decisions at the times that started at the times of Hillel and Shammai, that they started to separate Judaism from Israel. Until now, it's been umbilically tied together. Even during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, it was just 70 years. But now they see that they're heading into an exile that will probably be much longer. So they start to make the adjustments to the culture of our nation to make it that we can survive as a state in exile, a state without a homeland. And it's something that is an anomaly in world history. I often tell the story of the Jew and the lotus, the famous story of the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan leader, who I believe was in the 80s or maybe the 90s. He called together a group of rabbis and leaders of major Jewish organizations because he wanted to find out the secret as to how the Jew has been able to survive in exile for 2,000 years. Because here he looked at his own people, the Tibetan people, who were in exile, and said, my people are losing their culture. They're literally losing my religion. How am I going to combat this? And at that point, they had only been in exile for 30 years. Yet we've managed to do it for 2,000 years. The simple answer is because the Almighty guaranteed it. Go look in the Torah. Go read the book of Deuteronomy. It's promised to us with a guarantee that we will be here for eternity. No matter that we will be dispersed throughout the land. They'll try to kill us. They'll try to destroy us. We're going to be thrown all over the place. But in the end, we will come back to the land of Israel. And eventually we will have Mashiach Tzidkenu. We'll have the rebuilding of the temple. And we'll have the kingdom of David reestablished and the monarchy of David reestablished. It's a guarantee. That's the only answer for it. It's miraculous. That's the answer to the Dalai Lama. Practically, we see that Hillel and Shammai set the process into motion by a lot of their decisions of separating the people from the state, making it that we would be able to exist in exile. We'll continue with that more next week as we start to talk about the prelude to the destruction, and we will also talk about the rise of Christianity, very apropos for next week leading into the quote-unquote holiday season of the nations of the world. But now we've eventually shredded our way into the Common Era. Herod dies in the year 1. He makes a decree that on the day that he dies, that hundreds of rabbis should be put to death, because he wanted to make sure that the people would be sad and not rejoice when he died. So he ordered that hundreds of rabbis should be crucified outside of Jerusalem on the day of his death. Luckily, his mother, who got the order, did not follow through on it. And now Herod is gone. But we're going to see that the process that Herod has firmly put into motion will lead us to a slippery slope over the course of the next 70 years that will bring us to the destruction of the Second Temple and the end of the Second Commonwealth. We'll continue the story next week with the aftermath of Herod, with the beginning of Christianity, and the continued separation of the Jewish people from our homeland of Israel, preparing to survive and in many ways thrive as a nation in exile. I look forward to talking to you more next week. Everyone have a Freilich and Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. Hope to see you for the fireside chats at TorahAnyone.com, and I hope you have an amazing week. Thank you very much.